Now, what I'm going to do here is start off with a little story that we were at a conference, Adrian remembers this, that Jack Smart reported Quine as saying that Ruth Marcus should have done what she was good and stayed home with her children. And Adrian remembers this more accurately than I do, but I remember there was some remark of that kind. I don't believe that Jack had a clue what he was saying. I'm less sure about Quine, but that's what in a way I'm going to be talking about. I had one experience with Quine, which was interesting, and David Lewis told me later it was typical, that we were at one of the Chapel Hill colloquia. This was October 1991, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill used to run a colloquium. And during one of the days, we were out having lunch at Michael Resnick's farm, I was sitting down having lunch, and Quine came and sat down on one side of me, and somebody else, I think it was Paul Ziff, came down and sat the other side and started talking about how, without acknowledging that I was there, they started talking across me about how they couldn't understand all these people that believed in possible worlds. And I didn't have any clue at that point what happened, but David Lewis told me later that they would do this. This was a technique that they had. So that was my experience there. So what was going on here? What was going on, I think, was clearly that there was something more to Quine's feeling about modal logic. I think there was the sexism, I suppose, but I don't know that the sexism was the important thing. But there was something strongly emotional about Quine's attitude to modal logic, and that came out in so many ways. And this is what I want to talk about, because we all think that, well, a subject like logic, you wouldn't get your emotion involved there, and yet politics, social personalities, all sorts of things can get involved in this, and that's in a sense what I want to talk about. So let's look at a little bit of modal logic history. C.I. Lewis in 1918 wrote a book in which he was dissatisfied. He's always dissatisfied with the notion of implication in Principia Mathematica, but he realized that the convenient way to do this was to define strict implication, not as it's not the case that you have P true and Q false, but it's that it is impossible that you have PQ and true false. So he introduced two negation operators in his 1918 book. The tilde was for impossibility, and the straight bar was for negation. Some of this sort of thing is what will be on the handouts, this kind of information. If afterwards you need to look up and find out where I'm getting a lot of this from, I've tried to provide an indication in the handouts. That's what they're doing. So that the interesting thing here is let's look here at the social background of these people. C.I. Lewis's father was very, very active in the trade union movement. He was part of an organization called the Knights of Labor, and he was almost vilified in his village. They had to move places. So there was clearly political tension there going on. Quine, by contrast, of course, was the son of a business owner in Akron, Ohio. And in Akron, Ohio, his father had made a company that made molds for tires. Now that would have been a big thing. So that for Quine, and he said the family prospered, so that for Quine's family became rich. Whether there's anything in this difference, I don't know, but we've got to look at all the possible things. There's very little in a topic like this. There's very little you can say with certainty. You can only make some things plausible. And if you look at their backgrounds, this is one of the things that you can make plausible there. So that we've got the fairly disparate backgrounds of C.I. Lewis and W.E. Quine at that point. And Quine was sent to Oberlin, which is, if you look at a map, Oberlin is not so very far from Akron. And he and his brother were sent there. And then he, at the end of that time, he moved to Harvard and did a PhD at Harvard. He did his PhD with Whitehead, both he and another of the important figures. The other important figure here is William Tuttle Parry. And Parry is an interesting case because Parry was an exact contemporary of Quine's at Harvard. Both of them took a PhD. Parry, both of them went to Germany shortly after they had graduated. Quine went to visit Carnap, and Parry seems to have gone to the Soviet Union as well. And Parry became a communist and then became a socialist. So what we have there is something rather complicated, because Parry's 1939 article on modalities in the survey system of strict implication was one of the early articles. It wasn't the first of them, I'll come to that in a moment, but was one of the early articles that popularized the idea that there was a lot more to modal logic than the notion of modal degree, the notion of reduction of modalities. The notion of modality, of course, had been taken earlier by Oscar Becker. Now, Oscar Becker is an interesting case. Oscar Becker was at the University of Freiburg in Germany. And I've given you the title page of Oscar Becker's article. The journal is the Journal for Phenomenology and Philosophical Research, or Philosophy and whatever it is. But phenomenology is simply, literally, it's just the idea of finding things out by looking into yourself. So that when Becker says he's doing modal logic from a phenomenological point of view, he means you've got to look in and see what these operators mean. But you also combine that, he wants to say, with a formal theory. Now, phenomenology at Freiburg, when Becker was there, if you look at the title page, you'll find that at Freiburg, Becker was there, Heidegger was there, and Husserl was there, so that presumably Freiburg was known as a place which was sympathetic to the Nazi regime. And that's probably why Becker's been almost completely written out. Becker, in fact, was the person who actually discovered the notion of modal degree. It was Becker who saw the fact that when you took Lewis's axiom, which was if P strictly implies Q, that strictly implies that impossibly Q strictly implies impossibly P. Lewis had already had an axiom with an equality there, and Emil Post found that didn't work. But once you saw that, you could see that the consequent of that implication is of higher modal degree than the antecedent, because if P strictly implies Q, even if that's all in strict, then impossibly Q strictly implies impossibly P is obviously going to be one higher degree than the antecedent of that. So that was one of the things that Becker was responsible for finding. But because of Becker's sympathy, presumably, because of where he was and because of his sympathy, and he says he's doing it, if you look, he says he's looking at it from a phenomenological point of view. So phenomenology was the metaphysical view that in a way underpinned Nazism. Now, of course, at the same time, you had Carnap in Vienna, and you had the logical positivists. And the logical positivists were completely anti-metaphysical. So when when Quine went to Vienna, he went to visit Carnap, and he went to visit, and he went to hang out with the logical positive. So he was in Vienna for quite a time, and he went to Prague to visit Carnap. I don't know whether or not, I recall that there was one letter where I think, Carnap said she'd received a letter from 2 graduate students from the US. So it may well be that Parry also visited Carnap. But one thing we do know was that Parry visited the Soviet Union while he was there, and became a communist, and became active, and was an active socialist. In fact, in the 1950s, Carnap, if you look at one of the part of his obituary, Parry was in fact, his tenure, he was stripped of tenure, and he only just managed not to be sacked from the University of Buffalo, which is now sunny at Buffalo. But he was stripped of his tenure, and his salary was frozen from 1953 to 1961. So he was clearly, and he came before the House Un-American Affairs Activities Committee, and like many of them, he was quite happy to admit what he himself was doing, but in fact, he was not willing to give names of anyone else. And the committee required that, so he had to plead the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution and not to testify, and that was why Buffalo immediately stripped him of tenure until 1961. So this was the kind of thing that was happening. Now, the reason I mentioned Parry, of course, is that the two logicians who were in Germany at the time were Quine. Quine wasn't in that kind of trouble. Quine was quite active during the war in some kind of intelligence stuff. So, and Quine certainly, if you look at some of the documents that I've got, Quine certainly had no sympathy. He regarded people who protested the war in Vietnam as aiding the US enemy, aiding the enemy. So clearly, it's not difficult to see what Quine's view would have been during those years when Parry was being denied tenure for that time. So here we've got two kinds of influence, political influence. We've got the political influence in Germany, and then we've got the influence of the United States after the war. And you wouldn't have thought they would have affected modal logicians. We know that there were many people who lost their jobs, many philosophers who lost their jobs, but usually the dispute is portrayed as being between analytical philosophy and, say, continental philosophy, or however you want to put that. But of course, this is a dispute within logic itself. And it's a dispute that seems to have affected modal logic. So it was easy to portray the modal logic as being, if you like, consorting with the enemy. Modal logic represented metaphysics. Modal logic represented phenomenology. Modal logic was of that kind, so that the hard-headed logicians were supposed to follow Carnap, eschew metaphysics. Carnap, of course, was smart enough to see that if you are going to use something like the verification principle, you have to know in advance what you're looking for before you know whether or not it's true. So Carnap, and of course, one of the reasons Quine fell out with Carnap was because Carnap saw that the very kind of philosophy that he had could accommodate modal logic. It didn't need the metaphysics that he didn't like, and his notion of state descriptions and so on was designed in a way to do that. The only system he got was the system S5, but still he was sympathetic to modal logic, and that was what Quine fell out with him about. It does suggest to me that Quine and his remarks about Marcus, the little experience I had, suggests somebody who was very worked up about these things, who took a difference in philosophy to indicate much more than just a difference in philosophy. I mean, most of us would, I mean, as I often say to people, some of my best friends are relevance logicians. So of course, you don't let any sort of views that you have about your discipline, you don't normally let that interfere with your attitude to other people. Quine, it seems to me, now this is as I say, there's very little in this that I can actually prove. You can only read through things that seem not to make sense. Why was Quine so against modal logic? Was it just, it seems to be something more than that. Bill Lycan once told me that Quine hated metaphysics, and that, hated his teacher, hated C.I. Lewis. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But at any rate, the point is still that he seemed to think that this was that this was more. So let's now have a look a little bit more at this. We've got Lewis's. In 1932, Lewis and Langford came out. Quine was in Germany at the time, and so was Parry, and Quine was there meeting the Vienna Circle, and Parry, of course, was doing that, but also presumably was going and looking at Becker and looking at modal logic. And Parry's 1939 article is, I think, one of the ones that is one of the most important articles in modal logic. But I think Becker's articles are more important. Becker's articles, curiously enough, have not been translated before, but that thanks to Jacques Rich, who is here, we now have a translation. There are other translations too. There are two translations. One is Minari and I forgot the name, but they produced one already, and Jacques has got one that we're hoping to bring out in our Modal Logic in Europe book, which talks about all the early articles. There is something here going on, and what is going on does seem to show a connection between emotion, if you like, and politics and various other things. And that's part of what I'm trying to illustrate with this talk. Mostly what I'm illustrating it is by just little stories and little incidents, but the evidence for this, as I've said, is in the various handouts that we've got. So that now Carnap is a very interesting case, because Quine was, in a certain sense, I don't want to say disciple of Carnap's, but he went to Germany to meet Carnap and support him, I think, in his anti-metaphysical crusade. In later life, Carnap developed what was sometimes called the principle of tolerance, but I think it's more interesting than that. Carnap's view in later life was, well, look, metaphysics as such has no authority, but in fact, whenever we want to look at the world, we have to have a framework. And Carnap distinguished between what he called internal questions, which are questions which have yes, no answers, or whatever sort of answer the question has. Within the framework, they have their ordinary answers. And the criteria for what counts as a good answer is itself dictated by the format. But the format itself, the framework itself, you have to choose, and you have to choose that on pragmatic grounds. And that's often known as Carnap's principle of tolerance. Now, we have one remark in the letters, a 1938 letter from Quine to Carnap. This is in the volume, the edited correspondence between the Quine-Carnap correspondence. There is a copy there of a 1938 letter from Quine to Carnap, protesting at his principle of tolerance. His principle of tolerance, he said, it might lead you too far. It might lead you even to tolerate Hitler. So clearly, tolerance of modal logic in Quine's view seems to have been equivalent to tolerating Hitler. That's in a sense, that's where Quine was coming from. So in that sense, we really do have to look carefully at that. So that the other feature, the other person that is not looked at here, there's no evidence that Carnap, there's no evidence that Quine or Parry had met Modche Viberg. Now, Viberg was in Warsaw in 1927. He perished in Warsaw in the bombing sometime during the war. We don't know exactly when, but it was sometime in the war. And Viberg in Poland wrote a letter in 1927 to Lewis saying that he had been able to reduce all formulae to a normal form, a first degree normal form where no modal operators are in the scope of anything else. And that's one of the most important results there, because it's in a sense, if you read Viberg's paper, which now was translated by Stan Surma some years ago. If you read Viberg's paper, you will see that what he's doing is actually showing that you can give, it's called an extended class calculus. And he shows that you can model, using Hilbert and Ackermann's class calculus, you can actually model the system S5 on that. So that in a sense, Viberg's 1933 paper is the first published completeness proof in modal logic. It's only for S5, but it does give you, it's cited by Lewis, and Viberg wrote to Lewis. Viberg is not mentioned in any of these other authors. That there's no evidence that Quine or Carnap were. Carnap, I think, was aware of Viberg, and in fact, Carnap, in his Meaning and Necessity, where and even in his Modalities and Quantification, Carnap was able to say that there were similarities with what he was doing and what Viberg was doing. Quine, of course, was not interested in modal logic at all and thought that this was a lapse on Carnap's part. So in the post-war US, as we've said, the issue really was anti-communism. And in his youth, Parry had been a socialist. Parry had been a socialist, and he had, I think, been a member of the Communist Party, and as I said earlier, got into trouble at that point. We now come to the other key person here, and that's Ruth Marcus. I better just check to see how we're doing. Yes, that is Ruth Marcus, and Ruth Marcus. Ruth was probably the one that I knew quite well, but many of you I know knew Ruth, and. My story about Ruth Marcus goes back to the 1988 World Congress of Philosophy, which was held in Brighton. And Ruth and I were sitting together at at the dinner. And at a certain point in the dinner, some footman in an elaborate kind of red coat and tails and all sorts of things came and banged the staff down. Bang, bang, bang. Pray silence for the Lord Quinton. And Ruth was sitting here, Quinton, Tony Quinton, Lord Quinton. So she that I think to a certain extent will typify. I know that many of you have all sorts of Ruth Marcus stories, and there are all kinds of stories of that kind. But she was not here interested at that point. Now, the quote that I began from Quine seemed to have been that why didn't she stay home with her children? Now, clearly, this is because the problem for Quine, of course, is that even though you could possibly do things with modal logic at the propositional level, at least if it's in S5, and you can reduce all formulae to first degree formulae in which one modal operator, no modal operator is inside the scope of any other modal operator, then there's possibly a chance for, when you reduce it to a normal form and do things, there's maybe a chance for thinking of the operator as metalinguistic in some sense. But it's impossible to do that in the predicate case. And I'm grateful here to Alistair Urquhart, who pointed out that the formula, it's necessary that there is something which is F, but not necessarily F. If you actually split that over, if you put that, I've given you that proof, I think somewhere, it's box for some X, brackets, Fx and not box Fx. In other words, there has to be something. For example, there has to be some number, which is the number of the planets, but no number has to be the number of the planets, so that you can have something which is F. It's necessary that there be something which is F, but that thing which is F is not necessarily F. And that formula in quantificational logic was proved not to be reducible to first degree. Now that's important, of course, because it means that Ruth Marcus's contribution was more dangerous from Quine's perspective. I think what happened with Quine, and this is perhaps will get us back to closer to where we started. What happened with Quine was that he first of all thought that Lewis had just made a simple mistake with use and mention. In fact, to be honest, to be fair to Quine, if you do read Lewis's survey, you do find, and perhaps even in Lewis and Langford in the 1930 book, you do find that Lewis doesn't seem to be quite as clear as the difference between validity and necessity as perhaps he should have been. And certainly there was a habit. So you can get this habit in places like Principia Mathematica, where you would not, and of course this was what what Quine does. I think one part of Quine's work was to take Principia Mathematica and rewrite it, in which all the use mention all the use mention confusions in Russell were eliminated, and that's the sort of thing that he was able to do. Now this worked, as I say, for a certain point, but it comes completely to grief at the level of quantification. And in fact, the formula that I'm interested in a way, is a formula that says it's necessary that there is something which is F, but nothing is essentially F. So he linked it with essentialism. And in the end, if you read right through Quine, you find that his objection in the end, when he's seen everything, he realizes that Arthur Smulyan, I haven't put Smulyan down there, Smulyan is another of the unsung heroes here, who pointed out that to solve the morning star, evening star problem, you need the notion of scope. You have to have a certain scope ambiguity to solve it properly. And that is why the Church's solution and various Phrygian solutions don't really work, because they didn't seem to use the notion of scope. Now, that was important. And one of the things that Ruth Marcus was always on about was how people never appreciated the work of Smulyan, Arthur Smulyan, and of Fitch. Both Fitch and Smulyan produced that solution. Nobody thought of that. Everybody thought that the only solution to identity problems of that kind was by having intentional objects. That was Carnap's solution, and that was the one, and that was Church's solution, and that was the one that there was the sense reference distinction and the Phrygian distinction, and all of that was what got into the mainstream literature, and that probably was what made people a little bit skeptical of things. They didn't appreciate that the true solution was one that nobody ever looked at, and that was the one developed by Arthur Smulyan. And it does, of course, rely essentially on the difference between there is something which is, if you like, the star that appears in the morning, and there is something which appears at night, and this thing is the same. the thing that appears in the morning is the same as the thing that this is. And because it is the same, it is only one thing, and therefore it is necessarily the same. But that doesn't mean that the morning star is necessary, because the thing that is the morning star is only contingently the morning star, the thing that's the evening star is only contingently the evening star, and so you can solve it that way. But you have to solve it carefully, and you have to solve it, as Arthur Smulyan did, showing that the resources of Principia Mathematica, if you take scope seriously, are up to that, and that scope matters even when uniqueness is satisfied, and because uniqueness may be satisfied but not necessarily satisfied, and that's part of the problem. So that is what Smulyan did, and that is one of the things that Ruth Marcus championed and appreciated. That, and of course, because her axioms, the so-called BARCAN formula, is one which talks about the equivalence of two things: the necessity for everything to be phi, and for everything the necessity that it's phi. In the case of the existential quantifier with the necessity of operator, you don't have that equivalence. You have an implication, perhaps, at most, but you certainly don't have an equivalence. So that is the kind of issue that Smulyan was done, and that is the kind of issue that was never talked about. But you can see here, of course, that if you do find the idea of essentialism, if you do find, then Quine was able to reject the whole thing simply because he said, well, he didn't like quantifying into intentional context. But that was hardly an argument. Before, he thought he had a proof that it was use-mention confusion. But what it showed was that the necessity operator cannot be a metalinguistic operator, because otherwise you would certainly have troubles of the use-mentioned kind of quantifying in. And I think Quine always thought, and the problem, I think, with the identity paradoxes was that they started off with two names, phosphorus being Hesperus, and then there's a problem there because it looks like it's two names for the same thing. But the person I saw yesterday is the person the thing I'm looking at now is also my brother, or whatever, or whatever. So that something like that is going to be is going to have its contingency coming in from elsewhere, and not from the necessity part. And there's no suggestion here that my brother or the thing I'm looking at outside the window or whatever is an intentional object, and so on. So that is what Smulyan did, and that's what Ruth Marcus was protesting about. So you can see why, from all viewpoints, if there was sexism in Quine, Ruth Marcus ticked the wrong box. If there was anti-socialism in Quine, it ticked the wrong box, because if you look, Ruth Marcus came from a socialist family, and they paraded in New York every day. The big fight, of course, was the socialists and the communists, and while they were both in one way on the same side, and another way they were not on the same side. So you can see that even from that point of view, Quine is not going to, if Quine's anti-socialism worked against Parry and also worked against Ruth Marcus, then you can see why if there was sexism, if there was political stuff, if there was stuff within logic, both political, I mean, in a certain sense, the political divides within logic, the metaphysicians versus the logical positivists was also a divide. If you look at those divides, then you can see why, from a virtually every respect, Ruth Marcus was going to tick the wrong boxes. So that, in a way, insofar as there's an answer to my question, the answer to the question that I began with, and of course, it also brings back to the fact that my own experience with Quine, there was clearly Quine felt things emotionally very strongly. And from any point of view, a Quinean point of view, it looks as though Ruth Marcus ticked all the wrong boxes. So that in a sense, why did Quine hate Ruth Marcus? Now, hate is a strong word. I mean, I don't. It was probably inadvisable to use that word, but clearly he had strong feelings about Ruth Marcus, and it's probably those feelings which eventually might have been explained by the fact that she ticked all the wrong boxes, all the wrong Quinean boxes. So that, in a way, is an answer. I hope I've left plenty of time for discussion and so on. If there are things, other bits of clarification, I've left out, as you can see, I've left out all the arguments, but the reasons I give and the quotations and so on are all in the handout, which people can read, or they can ask me a little bit more about them, or so on. So that will give us plenty of time, I think. So is that all right?
Yeah, I mean, of course, completely up to you, Max. There is indeed a lot of time because you had like 1 hour and it's only 38 minutes, but it's perfectly fine. There is a lot of discussion time, I suppose, and
Well,
time to catch up with our friends as well. Okay, so then
it's better to have an hour and use 38 minutes than to have 38 minutes and use an hour.
that is definitely true. Yes,
but I can elaborate on things. I just gave you a summary, and I didn't include. I could have made it longer by reading all those passages that are on the handout. And if anybody wants me to discuss or comment on anything that's on the handout, then I can certainly do that.
So then maybe what we do at this point is that we open the floor to questions. So please, guys, if you have a question, type Q in the chat, and I will go over the list, and then we can have some discussion with Max. It's a very special time to have access to Max. All right, so we can start with Dave. Dave, do you want to go ahead, please?
Yeah, hello. Thanks for this, Max. This is really fascinating talk. I've been looking forward to it, and I now see I was right to do so. So I wanted to ask about sort of next steps going forward, right? So I'm reflecting on how I was introduced to this debate, and unsurprisingly, the politics were never mentioned. And so I'm wondering about the sort of transition between these personalities who are, butting heads for any number of reasons. But then, of course, what gets written down, at least in the journals, right, is it doesn't involve these sorts of reasons. And so at some point between the story you're telling and the present day, right, the politics kind of gets lost, and people like me come up into philosophy and go like, wow, Quine just made some really embarrassing mistakes on paper. Isn't that
I know.
Right. And so I wonder if you have any perspective from what you've seen or read or taken on board about how that kind of transition happens, how the sort of political or social aspects of this headbutting that you're talking about kind of get bleached out in the way to where we are today. How did this part of the story, what was it like as this part of the story sort of faded? What was that fading process like? If that makes sense.
I can't answer you now, but Adrian Rini and I have applied for a research grant to undertake just more generally, because Adrian has noticed, why did so many women become logicians? Were they frozen out of other things? Why were, there's all sorts of reasons. The difference between Oxford and Cambridge, where Oxford was training people for statesmen and so on. There are many questions. What I was intrigued with, there has been some work on the idea that during the Cold War, analytical philosophy was regarded as safe, and it was analytical philosophy was all right, but any philosophy that tried to tell people how to live what we now call practical ethics, that was no good. And what intrigued me was that these very same things could come within, if you like, the most analytical part of even of analytical philosophy, namely in formal logic. That there was this sort of thing there. And so there's a big research area And we're hoping to be able to get some grant money in New Zealand or somewhere anyway to be able to undertake this area. So the answer is yes. Your questions are wonderful questions, but they're much bigger than that. And if we can understand the more general questions, Parry's case was interesting because he was a socialist, and clearly now. I don't know any. You wouldn't know that from reading even his articles. Well, actually, that's not true. If you read, he wrote articles on political philosophy. When he's not doing his logic articles, you find that Parry wrote an article contrasting the use of war in Germany and in the Soviet Union. And his conclusion was that for Germany, the war machine governed the politics, and for the Soviet Union, the politics governed the war machine. Now, whether that's wrong or right or not, but that was the sort of thing whether he was a socialist apparently in his youth. I think he was an undergraduate at Columbia, and apparently I gather that some of the universities in New York were much more left-leaning than other places. So there's an enormous amount of work to be done of this. And what intrigues me is to be able to take it to the most arcane and the most elaborate and specialized area of logic and find that it's there even there. And so, yes, you're right. And I don't yet know the answers, but this is something that Adrian Reedy and I are really working on, and we're trying to find out where this is going on around the world and what's happening. There is more interest in this kind of thing going on, and I don't know so much of it going on within logic, but that's what I'm intrigued with. And if anyone is interested in this kind of research project, please contact one of us. And because we certainly, if we do get some grant money, it'll usually mean money to travel. And that means that we can go and find the other people who are interested in doing this sort of thing, or bring them here. I mean, depending on how much money you get. So that's the sort of thing. So yes, sorry, I answered you probably long. I hope that was the kind of answer that you. It was saying we want to get the answers to the questions you were asking.
Yeah, and it helped me see connections up to a range of other things. Thank you so much.
Good. Okay.
Fantastic. So then the next person in the queue is Charles. Charles, do you want to go ahead?
Yes. That was a really fascinating talk, Max. It was very interesting indeed. A couple of quick things I would like to sort of enlarge on and then sort of look at your comments. So first thing, it's always struck me as very weird that people invent modern logic, made basically the predicate calculus in the early years of the century, and then they brag about how great it is because it allows you much more expressive power. You can, display many, many more inferences as valid than you could in the older logic. And so, it's really great. It's an ocean liner as compared to a canoe. That's Russell's phrase. And then suddenly there's this sort of thus far and no further thing, which you get, for example, in the Tractatus. So you say in the Tractatus, well, nothing that can't, basically, broad brush, of course, nothing that can't be expressed in the vocabulary of the predicate calculus really makes sense. The world can be depicted using solely this conceptual apparatus. And there's an obvious problem in that the mere formulation of the thesis is inconsistent with the thesis. So you'd have thought that everybody would say, okay, now we've done a really great job with the logic of relations and we've got quantifiers and stuff. Hey, why not modal operators? But there's this sudden thus far and no further thing. Quine, of course, being a particular culprit in this respect, because his rhetoric is, here's this wonderful logic handed down from us by our fathers, and you think, what? It's only been invented a few years ago. What about what this sort of conservative rhetoric is really weird. You know, he's just deeply opposed to it. But you seem to be suggesting that, as it were, Quine's anti-metaphysical thing comes from a fairly conservative right-wing perspective. But of course, that can't be the whole story, because the logical positivist anti-metaphysical thing comes mainly from a fairly left-wing perspective. So I just wondered if you wanted to comment on any of the things I've been saying and what your response might be.
Well, there are a number of things to say. Firstly, I'm not sure that I would characterize Quine. I think Quine really was a metaphysician. He thought that he was an anti-metaphysician. Right. And I think he fell out with Carnap because he was a metaphysician. And Carnap was saying, oh, you can have a framework which allows you to believe in things like possible world or whatever, or this or that, or anything else. You can have a framework that does anything provided it works. Now, Carnap was the genuine anti-metaphysician, and his falling out with Quine, although it may not have looked to Quine like that, was because Quine was a metaphysician. Quine, there were metaphysicians here. I think there were 3 metaphysicians I can think of. One is Quine, one is Jack Smart, and one is Arthur Pryor. They all thought that the debates between them were real ones, that there really was only a precedent, or there really was this, or there was that. Now, Quine, I think, was one of those. So in a way, in that respect, I think Quine is a metaphysician. Now, you were talking about how the first order theory, if you, one of the powerful things is not just first order logic, but first order logic can be stated using one two-place predicate, namely the membership predicate. And if you have set theory, you can model almost anything. There are problems about finiteness and so on with model with compactness and so on. But by and large, even when you do modal logic, you can take a collection of possible worlds and you can have a relation between them and so on. So there is something to the power of first order logic with one two-place predicate, but it's the two-place predicate. It's not, first order logic provides a framework for a two-place predicate. Anything that provides a framework for a two-place something or other. Now, modal logic, although it has operators, in a sense can be modeled in a theory of worlds and relations between them, so that there's a certain sense in which first order logic needs some extra power, but it's a framework that the power can be given. Of course, the point about modal logic is that we don't normally talk by quantifying over possible worlds in first order language. We can model it that way if we want to, but the problem is that Quine eventually saw that. Quine eventually saw that his only objection to modal logic had to be metaphysical, because once he saw what cryptic semantics did, he was able to see, well, you can model all these things using one two-place relation and a collection of worlds. So that in a certain sense, he had to change his objection to an objection to Aristotelian essentialism. The point at which Quine's objection to modal logic changed and became metaphysical was precisely the point at which he saw how you could model it using a first order language. Now, I don't know exactly how much that answers the question that was bothering you, but in a certain sense, I think the answer is that it was at that point Quine became a metaphysician.
That's good. I'll let someone else have a go. You said lots of good things, so I won't follow up. Somebody else can have a go.
Yeah.
All right. So then, Martin, do you want to go ahead and ask the question? Yeah.
Yes, I was at the AEL conference that Max alluded to, where Jack Smart gave his talk. And I remember it well. Jack well, I remember it partially, but because of the fuss it caused afterwards. But I remember that Jack talked about a logician, presumably Quine, who had made a remark about a female logician, presumably Ruth Marcus, and the remark was that she wasn't very pretty. I didn't remember anything about that she ought to be home with the children. But that
well,
caused,
it's a similar kind of sentiment,
sure,
isn't it?
sure. But it caused a lot of trouble at the meeting because some people strongly objected to what Jack had said, although he was only reporting what Quine had said, and some of them actually left the conference over it.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I don't remember it exactly. Adrian remembers it better.
Yeah.
She was motivated to leave at that
Yes,
point.
that's right. I didn't want to dobber in.
Oh no, I don't think she minds being
No.
known for that. Do you? Oh, I'm sorry. But anyway, yeah, no, that was. Well, you remember it a little bit more. I mean, maybe there were a number of things he said, but
Could be. He could have said both.
But it had to be Quine and Marcus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's actually very interesting. Anyone else? Any other questions? So we have still some time actually for questions. So 7 minutes. So if anyone else wants to have a go. Ed, please, Ed, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for that, Max. That was really interesting. Of course, we've been talking about this stuff for quite a while,
but you know more about Lewis than I do.
Well, yeah, but it's not about Lewis. What I think is kind of interesting and kind of unfortunate was that from the phenomenological side, the phenomenologist seems to have forgotten all about Becker and his work, although he wrote an appendix, which is really interesting about the trying to sort of give a phenomenological reading of the Tractatus. There was an appendix to Husserl's formal and transcendental logic, and there's a lot of really neat stuff that's been lost through that. But the sort of political, and you can see it's quite political for them as well. The phenomenologists have this sort of animosity towards logic that they associate, and they associate logic entirely with a very sort of cartoonish version of positivism. That sort of, so from that other side, there's this difficulty as well, and it would be really, the comment only is, it would be really nice to sort of wash this stuff away and look at this history in a more
good. So there's even more in this than I've been thinking. I mean, one of the things that I've been learning now is that there's a lot more to be done here.
I think that's right. I think that there was a kind of a point at which in the late 20s where a lot of these ruptures hadn't happened yet. Michael Friedman has a nice book on it doesn't deal with logic, but it's Carnap and Heidegger is what it's about, called Parting of the Ways, and talks about this conference in Switzerland where they talk to each other in Davos in I think 29 or 30, and it would be nice to situate some logical views in there as well as certain metaphysical or anti-metaphysical views as well.
Yes, I wish that when I'd met Carnap, which was only once just before he died, all I could think of to ask him is whether he ever used the word, the capital letter L for necessity in modal logic. But if I knew now, if I knew now what I knew then, what I know now about it, there were all sorts of things I could have asked him. But still, however,
All right.
he didn't.
Sorry, Max, go ahead. Yeah?
Oh, it doesn't matter. I was just saying that Carnap didn't have much time when I asked me what I was doing in Los Angeles. I said I was going to Richard Montague's lectures on a logical basis for English. He said, "Well, why do you bother with languages like that when you could use artificial ones?" However, sorry, that was.
No, but that's a nice remark, I think. I also agree with that remark, I must say. Yes, it's very nice when you use an artificial one. So, Rod, do you want to go ahead? Rod has a question as well, please.
Yes, I wondered whether you've got any opinion about Hinteke's approach to modality, where he seems to be confirming what you've just said about once you've got set theory, then it's all there. And so Hinteke, in some sense, has already done that with his model system semantics. Or was he just ducking around the controversy?
I haven't thought about that. I mean, so long ago since I met Hinteke, and I can't remember what we talked about, but
you probably might want not to remember what you talked about.
well, maybe yes. This was when this was about 1970 or so, but no, I think he even put me up for the night. I can't remember anyway. But no, he was. Look, I don't know that I can help on that one. I need to look and see. I think he possibly wanted to try to avoid the metaphysics in some sense, but because the model sets were supposed to be kind of linguistic, weren't they? They were sets of sentences.
Well, it looks to me that his model sets are ducking around a whole lot of controversy.
yeah, probably,
and
yes.
Trying to provide a set theoretic account without possible worlds, without modalities, explaining modality in straight off set theoretic ways.
But also, I think too, Hinteke wanted to be known as doing something that was his. That I think he probably thought that what he was doing was different and presumably better than the other ways. He didn't want to feel that his views were from anyone else's in a certain sense, because it was almost about they were coming out. That was coming out almost at the same time as Kripke's original work, wasn't it?
Yes.
So
it goes way back. Yes,
that's right. And I think he may have been a little bit resentful that other people were becoming more famous than he was as a result of this. I don't know. So
well, his knowledge and belief book was published long before the sort of the real emphasis on possible worlds.
Yes.
So,
but it was more like, I mean, it was not.
It was in the middle of the controversy. Suddenly, this appears, and you look at it and say, well, this is modal logic, except it's not modal logic.
Well, I think it's never clear to me, I must look at it again, because it's a while since I've looked at it, but as I think it was never clear whether it was the semantic side or the syntactic side that was doing the work for Hinteke.
It could be argued that it is syntactical, that's for sure.
Yes, that's right. And that therefore it was modeled, so it had a link. I think it was, in a way, even Kripke's 1959 article was still talking about models. It wasn't till, I can't remember when it was first realized that it didn't matter what these indices were. I think probably by Kripke's 1963 paper, but that only very recently came to be stressed, that it can be any collection of things with a relation on it which will model them. And that was something that showed that it was purely semantic. And I think, and that was, and in particular, if they could be anything they like, they could actually be the whole world or the what, you know, because it was so abstract. And that was, I don't think we realized it at the time. I know I didn't realize it at the time, and I think it was about after Kripke's 1963 paper. Kripke came to talk to us when I was a graduate student in Manchester, and everybody else seemed to understand what he was doing, and I found it very hard to follow. So, that's why I ended up writing textbooks, because I find everything so hard to follow. However,
that was a very successful strategy. The one that you Final question goes to John. John, please go ahead. John, can you hear me? We cannot hear you.
Sorry.
Yep.
I'll try again. Okay. The Hintiker in the 63 paper in the volume that I edited for the Oxford
oh,
Conference,
right. Yes.
refers to
somewhere on the bookshelf behind me.
in 55, and also a Theoria paper in 61, the first one of which is very significant in terms of size. So, and in the 63 volume, he was already talking about model sets. Yeah.
Okay.
Just a little story with, you know, Saul Kripke was very difficult to understand in 63. But at that same conference, there was a group of top people looking at
That's
PJ
what you want, isn't it? That's what you want.
That's the one.
That's the one.
we had a session one night when people were looking at Paul Cohen's consistency of the continuum hypothesis, and there was absolutely nobody who could follow that. Kripke was relatively easy in comparison, although it was
okay. Oh well,
that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah.